Hello, I'm Dr. Lawrence Publikova from the School of English at the University of Leeds. I work mainly on Renaissance drama, including Shakespeare, with a particular interest in literature and the sea. The question I'm going to be answering today is how, if at all, does Shakespeare manage to persuade us that his characters are using real speech? Well, let me begin by saying something crushingly obvious, which is that, unlike the majority of Shakespeare's characters, real people in Shakespeare's time didn't speak in verse. They certainly spoke in an English that had a different vocabulary to the one we speak now, but equally certainly, they didn't go around speaking in blank verse, that is, in the unrhymed iambic pentameter that lays the foundations for Shakespeare's plays. So does Shakespeare even try to persuade us that his characters are using real speech? Well, it's actually quite a complex question. I think I'd want to begin by stating that all Shakespearean speech, whether it's prose or verse, is artificial. Not necessarily in the pejorative sense of being something painfully or depressingly fake, but artificial in the sense of something crafted, something artful. It might help to begin by thinking about the setting within which Shakespeare's language is spoken. In his own time, Shakespeare's plays were staged in three main locations: in large outdoor amphitheatres, such as the Curtain or the Globe, at the smaller and more expensive indoor playhouses, the Blackfriars, and at court. But when we think of Shakespeare's plays being performed in his own time, we quite rightly think primarily of the first of these categories, the large outdoor playhouses. This is roughly what they would have looked like. This is a contemporary sketch of another theatre from this period, the Swan, and this is a photograph of the modern rebuilding of the Globe, the interior of it, which opened in Bankside in 1997 in London. Now, possibly the most important thing about these kinds of theatres, and the reason I bring the playing space to your attention, is that they allow actors to create a particular kind of dramatic illusion. If you studied theatre at all, you may have heard of the expression breaking the fourth wall. This refers to the process by which actors break or dismantle the notional wall that stands between the world of the audience and the world of the play. For when we go to the theatre, on the whole, we pretend that the actors can't see us. In a sense, we pretend that we're not there, and we sit in the dark to help create this feeling. In the theatres in Shakespeare's time, things were very different. For one thing, these plays would have been put on in the afternoon, around 2 p.m. in broad daylight. The playgoers could all see one another. And more than this, the playgoers made up an important part of the playgoing experience. Theatres like the Globe didn't really have a fourth wall. And the construction of the language in Shakespeare's plays, in fact, makes this quite apparent. Think about the asides and soliloquies spoken in the plays. In one sense, when a character like Hamlet speaks in an aside or a soliloquy, he is speaking to himself. But he is also speaking to an audience that he knows is there. In that sense, we, the audience, are himself. Shakespeare's plays establish a different kind of dramatic illusion from the kind that we are today most familiar with. Now, this kind of dramatic illusion clearly has some impact on whether or not we think of the language of Shakespeare's characters as real speech. When we're watching a TV drama like, say, Mad Men, or a play like Harold Pinter's The Caretaker, we expect the characters to speak to one another naturally, as they would in real life. Why? Well, one reason is because they don't know we're there. In most, though by no means all, TV drama and 20th century theatre, what we are watching is a version of real life that we have somehow been let in on. We are behind a fourth wall. In Shakespearean drama, as I've suggested, something slightly different is going on. We are watching works of art that, at least in some respects and at some points, know themselves to be works of art. And for that reason, among others, their language is artificial. Shakespeare's plays do, of course, deal with the ethical problems and the varied emotions that we encounter in real life, but they do not themselves pretend to be, directly, real life. This is why they do not need to reproduce what we would think of as real speech. Instead, like opera, like ballet, Shakespeare uses a particular medium to represent action in emotion, and where opera uses music and song, and ballet uses music and dance, Shakespeare uses verse and prose. Now, I wouldn't by any means wish to suggest that Shakespeare never uses language that could be taken as natural or real speech. In some episodes, particularly episodes that stage conversations between two or more people, Shakespeare aims for a directness that can be attained by using language that gets very close to being natural. You might, for example, think of the very first lines of Hamlet. At the opening of this play, Shakespeare wants to create a sense of fear and confusion. And the best way of attaining this is not to have someone reel off 20 lines of blank verse explaining where they are and what's going on, but instead to have this very sudden, short bits of language that are full of questions. The play opens with sentinels changing guard, and the first line is from Bernardo, "Who's there?" Francisco says, "Nay, answer me. Stand and unfold yourself. Long live the king." Bernardo? He. This is pretty close to real speech, short, disorganized, confused. Only the word unfold seems slightly, as it were, unnatural. What Francisco means here is declare who it is that you are. But there is something in the word unfold that seems to carry the idea of something terrifyingly unknown, and this is appropriate for a scene that is about to feature a ghost that refuses to unfold himself. And this is the point of using such artificial rather than simply natural language. It allows Shakespeare to create particular effects. Whether prose or verse, Shakespeare's language is unnatural in its richness of imagery and metaphor, and this helps Shakespeare to establish dramatic atmosphere. Atmosphere that, it's important to remember, he couldn't rely on especially sophisticated scenery or musical effects to establish. In some sense, Shakespeare uses language to create the effects that a film director might attain by way of a soundtrack or a sweeping landscape. Let me give an example. His protagonist Macbeth, realizing that he will have to commit more and more crimes in order to stay alive, says, "I am in blood stepped in so far, that, should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go o'er." Now, this is, of course, a touch unnatural. Perhaps it would be more natural to say, "I think I'm going to have to kill someone else. It's too late to undo what I've already done." But this more natural speech would also be far less effective. By having Macbeth say, "I am in blood stepped in so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go o'er," Shakespeare creates a terrifying image of a man wading through a river of blood, an image that helps add colour and depth to the world Shakespeare evokes within this particular play. When all of Macbeth's characters speak, they use a particular diction that seems particular to this particular play. They speak in images of blood, of darkness and night, of an alarming natural world. And they do so not because this is how real people speak, but because their images help to establish a particular mood. I would now like to complicate some of the points I've made, in particular by developing this idea that some speeches in Shakespeare seem more real than others. First, I want to have a look at two soliloquies, one by Richard III and one by Iago, the villain of Othello. To go back over some of the things I've said, these two soliloquies are, at least in three senses, artificial. First, because both Richard and Iago are speaking to themselves, something that we don't frequently do in real life, or at least not in a particularly organised way. Secondly, because both Richard and Iago are speaking to us, an audience of which they're to some extent aware. And thirdly, because both of the speeches are in verse. And yet it seems to me that there's something quite different in the ways in which they're constructed. And this difference is directly related to this question of what might constitute real speech. So first, this is the opening speech by Richard in Shakespeare's play, Richard III. Richard of York, as he is at this stage, enters alone and delivers the following lines. Quite famous lines. "Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York, and all the clouds that lured upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarums changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures. But I, that am not shaped for sportive tricks, nor made to court an amorous looking-glass, I, that am rudely stamped, and want love's majesty to strut before a wanton ambling nymph, I, that am curtailed of this fair proportion, cheated of feature by dissembling nature, deformed, unfinished, sent before my time into this breathing world scarce half made up, and that so lamely and unfashionable that dogs bark at me as I halt by them. Why, I, in this weak piping time of peace, have no delight to pass away the time, unless to spy my shadow in the sun, and descant on mine own deformity." Now this is in many respects a great speech. It's rhetorically extremely effective. Note the anaphora, the repetitions of our and I that give the passage momentum and a sense of energy. It's also an effective and efficient speech. It does at least two things. Unlike the opening of Hamlet, at which we've just looked, it very clearly sets the scene for us at the beginning of the play. The wars between the houses of York and Lancaster have halted, and in a time of peace, Richard comes onto the stage. And it tells us plenty about the main character of this play. He is not a man made for peace, he tells us. He is deformed. He feels out of place in this soft, amorous, peaceful environment. In these opening lines, Shakespeare establishes conflict and an interest in character. The point I want to make here, though, is that this is a speech that feels complete. Its rhetorical structure helps to convey this effect. This is a set piece. Richard already seems to know what he's going to say before he says it. He's setting the scene, giving us a snapshot of himself and his world. In this sense, the speech is quite static. It conveys a slice of time rather than moving through time. Compare it now to this soliloquy from Othello. Here, the character Iago is thinking about the ways in which he might take revenge on his superior, the Moor Othello. If you don't know the play, don't worry too much about the plot content of this soliloquy. Instead, listen to the way that it moves. This is another soliloquy in blank verse, but its structure and form are very different from the speech we just heard from Richard. So Iago says, I hate the Moor, and it is thought abroad that twixt my sheets he's done my office. I know not if it be true. Yet I, for mere suspicion in that kind, will do as if for surety. He holds me well, that better shall my purpose work on him. Cassio's a proper man, let me see now. To get this place and to make up my will, a double knavery. How? How? Let me see. After some time, to abuse Othello's ear that he is too familiar with his wife. He has a person, and a smooth disposed to be suspected, framed to make women false. The Moor, a free and open nature, too, that thinks men honest, that but seems to be so. I had. It is engendered. This is not the speech of a man who has a fully formed thought that he wants to communicate to us. Instead, it is a man thinking while he is speaking. Iago gets somewhere during the course of this speech. At the beginning of it, he doesn't have a plan. By the end, he does. I have it. It is engendered. This is a less polished piece of verse than the one spoken by Richard. It lacks the sense of fluency and the rhetorical strength of Richard's soliloquy. But Shakespeare is here aiming at something quite different. He wants to show us, as it were, the workings of Iago's mind. So although both soliloquies are in blank verse, and although both present artificial situations, a man speaking out loud apparently to himself, we might think of Iago's soliloquy as being, in some respects at least, closer to real speech. This is not, I would stress, a question of saying that Shakespeare is writing better at the moments when he gets closer to what feels like real speech, and I'll come back to this point. I want first, though, to move on to thinking about Shakespeare's movement between prose and verse, and what this might tell us about the realism of his speech.